The mist hung thick over the gardens of Winthorpe Manor, shrouding the grand estate in an eerie, otherworldly silence. The only sound that broke the stillness was the distant toll of the church bell. Counting the hours, this was not the sort of place where one would expect a murder to occur. The estate, nestled on the edge of the village, was known for its sprawling hedgerows and the labyrinthine maze at its heart, a feature that gave it its infamous reputation that it was a night like no other when the call had come to Lord Winthorpe's family solicitor. And soon the entire manor was awakened by the grim news. A murder had been discovered, one that no one could explain, and more importantly, no one had yet seen. The victim was none other than Lady Helena Winthorpe, the Lord's eldest daughter, and she had been found within the heart of the maze, dead under the most inexplicable circumstances. The crime itself, when first examined, seemed almost laughable in its simplicity, almost too simple to be believable. No one had heard a sound, no one had seen a thing, and yet there was the body, sprawled on the damp earth, with only a single clue left behind, a copper ring, engraved with a symbol that seemed more cryptic than meaningful, tucked tightly in the palm of Lady Helena's hand. She was otherwise untouched, no signs of struggle, no wounds, nothing out of the ordinary except for the fact that she was dead. The labyrinth had stood for generations, a physical and mental puzzle that had often tested the wits of those who dared to enter. However, it had never been more than a curious feature until now, its corridors and hedges now becoming the stage for a macabre act. By morning, the air was filled with whispered theories and growing panic. The servants, the guests, the family, all of them were bewildered. Who could have done it? Why? The more they tried to make sense of it, the more it seemed impossible. It was as though the crime had simply appeared. No motive, no suspect, and no clear path of logic that could lead to the answer. And then came the detective, the famed Lord Peter Wimsey. His arrival was a welcome one, though the confusion and despair had already settled over the manor like an unwelcome fog. But Wimsey was not easily deterred by such things. His reputation as an investigator who could untangle even the most impossible of mysteries was well known. He arrived with his usual calm, exuding the sort of assured confidence that, though comforting to the distressed, seemed almost alien in the face of such an inexplicable tragedy. The first thing he did was study the maze from the comfort of the manor's great hall, surveying the sprawl of bushes and twisted pathways as if attempting to understand the very essence of the crime itself. Tell me everything, he had instructed. The estate's keeper, a weary man named Farley, who had been among the first to discover the body. Farley, his face pale and drawn, recounted the events in a strained voice. The lady had been last seen earlier in the evening, attending a small gathering in the drawing room. There had been no indication of distress, no hint that something might have been amiss. Yet, by the time the household had settled into bed, she had disappeared. The night watchman, who had only briefly turned his back, had been the one to find her dead, surrounded by the silent walls of the maze, her hand tightly clutching the odd copper ring. The ring, Farley added, his voice wavering. What do you suppose it means, sir? Wimsey examined the ring closely, turning it over in his fingers. The symbol on it was unfamiliar, intricate, but meaningless at first glance, an abstract shape that might have once been a letter or a sigil. But there was no immediate clue to its origins. A most curious clue, Wimsey murmured, and entirely out of place, I would imagine, in the setting. This isn't the sort of thing one expects from a respectable lady of the manor. Farley nodded, looking as though he might faint from the tension in the air. Wimsey's eyes narrowed, his mind already working. He turned his attention to the maze itself. The hedges were high and thick, their labyrinthine twists providing a perfect hiding place for anyone who might want to commit a crime undetected. But there was something strange about the very arrangement of the paths, something that felt deliberate. It's been changed, Wimsey said suddenly. The maze, it's been altered, or rather, it has been constructed to give the impression of being more labyrinthine than it truly is. Farley blinked, confused. But the maze has always been this way. Not exactly, Wimsey replied, stepping forward to point at a section of the maze just visible from the hall. You see, the section here, these paths are newer. Whoever designed this maze had a particular purpose. And I believe that purpose had a very specific goal in mind, to mislead anyone trying to find the truth. Farley stared at the maze, unsure of what he was hearing. The crime itself is far simpler than it seems. The killer didn't need to be hidden in the maze. The maze itself, in its complexity, became the perfect place to hide the truth, Whimsy said. Whoever did this knew the layout of the maze better than anyone else. They knew exactly how to make the clues disappear. It was at that moment that the full scope of the crime began to take shape. In Whimsy's mind, the ring, the maze, Lady Helena's mysterious death, all of it was connected, but the connection was not immediately visible. Whimsy needed to speak to the lord of the manor, Lord Winthrop himself. It was time to delve into the history of the family, the intricate relationships, and the motives that might be hiding just beneath the surface. As he moved toward the study to meet Lord Winthrop, a sense of anticipation rose within him. The mystery was no longer simply about a murder. It was about a history of deception. Hidden beneath the smooth exterior of an ancient estate, the labyrinth was not just a garden. It was a symbol of the tangled web of secrets that had ensnared everyone. Within it, and in that maze of lies, only the sharpest mind could find the way out. Whimsy's investigation had truly begun. Whimsy's steps echoed through the dimly lit hallways of Winthrop Manor. As he made his way to the study, where Lord Winthrop awaited him, the old man, pale and shaken, had been pacing nervously by the window, his eyes distant as though the weight of the night's tragedy had pressed down on him with an unbearable force. But as Whimsy entered, the Lord straightened, a strained smile flickering across his face. "Ah, Lord Whimsy, I trust you've already been briefed on the unfortunate events of last night." Lord Winthrop's voice was thick with exhaustion. "I have indeed," Whimsy replied, his gaze lingering for a moment on the man before turning toward the desk, which was cluttered with papers, maps, and the occasional glass of untouched brandy. "Though, I must confess, the particulars of the crime remain a mystery to me. What I know is that Lady Helena is dead, and the maze seems to be the key. But I find myself wondering what else is there that I have yet to see." Lord Winthrop's brow furrowed, but his expression remained unreadable. "There is nothing more, I assure you. She went into the maze, and well, the rest is, I'm afraid, as you already know." Whimsy's eyes narrowed as he studied the Lord's face. There was something in his eyes, something more than sorrow, a flicker of hesitation that could easily be mistaken for fear. But Whimsy did not press the matter. He turned instead to the scattered papers on the desk, picking up a few at random. But they provided little insight. They were reports, nothing more routine. Impersonal documents that had been hastily assembled in the wake of Lady Helena's death. "What do you make of the copper ring?" Whimsy asked, turning his gaze back to Lord Winthrop. "I've never seen anything quite like it." Lord Winthrop hesitated, a brief moment of discomfort flashing across his face. "It's nothing," he muttered quickly, though his voice lacked the certainty of someone telling the truth. "A trinket, a family relic perhaps. I'm sure it has no bearing on the matter at hand." Whimsy raised an eyebrow but said nothing, instead giving a casual nod. "Of course, still, it's curious how tightly she held it. It might suggest it was of more significance than you suggest." The Lord stiffened, but before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. A servant entered, holding a tray with a steaming cup of tea. Whimsy accepted it with a polite smile, his thoughts still elsewhere. As the servant exited, Whimsy's gaze flickered over to the mantel above the fireplace. A large, ornate mirror hung there, its surface polished to a sheen, reflecting the dim light in an almost unnatural way. Something about it caught his eye, something subtle yet disconcerting. He crossed the room slowly, his footsteps deliberate, and stood before the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, but his attention was drawn to the edges of the frame. There, almost imperceptibly, were tiny scratches, marks that had been hastily wiped away, but still visible upon closer inspection. "Lord Winthrop," Whimsy said without turning, his tone casual. "Tell me about this mirror. Has it been moved recently?" The Lord's eyes darted toward the mirror, his face flushing. "No, I believe it's always been there, a family heirloom. As it were, I wouldn't think to touch it." Whimsy studied the marks for a moment longer before turning back to the Lord. Curious, he murmured, almost to himself, "It seems as though someone tried to clean it in a hurry." Lord Winthrop opened his mouth to protest, but Whimsy's keen gaze cut him off. "I wonder," Whimsy continued, his voice low and measured, "if the real question here is not who murdered Lady Helena, but rather who has something to hide." The Lord faltered, his hands twitching slightly, betraying his unease. Whimsy could see that he was no longer the calm, collected figure he had been when the investigation began. His composure was cracking, just barely, like a mask slowly slipping off. It was becoming clear that something was amiss, something deeper than the murder itself. "Perhaps we should take a walk in the garden, Lord Winthrop," Whimsy suggested, the suggestion more a command than an invitation. The Lord did not respond at first. Instead, he stared at Whimsy, as though sizing him up, before nodding stiffly. "Very well. A brief walk might help clear my mind." As they walked down the long hallway, Whimsy's sharp eyes caught every detail, the way Lord Winthrop's footfalls quickened as they neared the grand staircase, the barely perceptible shift in his posture as they passed a certain portrait Lady Helena's, as it happened hung with an almost unnatural prominence on the wall. The fleeting glance he cast toward it suggested something far beyond mere paternal affection. Outside, the cold air bit at their faces as they crossed the gravel path toward the maze. The night had fully descended, and the estate's long shadows stretched eerily across the grounds. The maze loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the moonlight. Whimsy paused at the entrance, his gaze turning once more to Lord Winthrop. "Tell me, sir, was Lady Helena alone when she entered the maze?" Whimsy asked, his voice steady but insistent. The Lord hesitated. "She was, yes, I believe so. I wasn't with her, if that's what you mean." "And when was the last time you saw her?" Whimsy pressed. "Just before she went out for a walk, earlier that evening. She seemed distracted, but I thought little of it." Whimsy's eyes flickered over the surrounding area as his mind worked through the puzzle. "And what of the servants? Anyone who might have seen her leave?" "None that I know of," the Lord replied, his voice tight, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something guilt, perhaps, or a subtle tension that told Whimsy otherwise. He had not yet said everything, and Whimsy knew it. The detective turned his attention to the maze again, then back to Lord Winthrop. "I think it's time to speak with the servants, my lord. There are a few more details to uncover." As Whimsy moved toward the entrance of the maze, Lord Winthrop lingered behind, standing motionless for a long moment. His eyes were fixed on the labyrinth before him, as if it held more than just the echoes of a night gone horribly wrong. It was as if he were silently wrestling with something. He had not yet confessed. Whimsy didn't look back. His instincts told him that the truth was hiding just beneath the surface, tangled up in the very fabric of the manor's history, waiting for the right eyes to see it. The first cracks in the facade had appeared, and now the game was afoot. The labyrinth stood silent before them, its towering hedgerows casting long shadows across the ground, as though it held secrets too vast to be revealed in one night. Whimsy turned back to Lord Winthrop, who had remained quiet during their brief examination of the maze's entrance. There was a certain heaviness in the air, an oppressive sense that something was being deliberately concealed. "Let us begin with the staff," Whimsy said, his voice calm yet resolute. "I'd like to speak with the servants, Lord Winthrop. I believe there's something to be uncovered there." The Lord nodded stiffly, his lips pressed tightly together, but there was a faint trace of something, perhaps regret, perhaps reluctance in his demeanor. Whimsy made no comment as they moved through the winding paths of the manor, toward the servants' quarters. The household was a large one, and every servant, from the cook to the stable boy, had been working when the tragedy struck. But Whimsy knew that a careful word or a subtle question could often reveal more than the most elaborate confession. The first person they spoke to was the housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Cartwright, who had been in charge of the domestic affairs at Winthrop Manor for years. Her face, flushed from the cold night air, held a certain defensiveness as she greeted them in the cramped, dimly lit room she called her domain. "Lady Helena. Such a lovely girl, sir," Mrs. Cartwright said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "She was always so proper, so polite, never a trouble. But this, I never thought. Whimsy studied her closely, his eyes narrowing as she continued to speak, her voice quivering with feigned sorrow. Did you see her leave the house last night? Whimsy asked, his tone gentle but probing. Mrs. Cartwright hesitated, looking down at her hands. No, sir, I didn't. But she often took late walks in the garden, you see. Always a solitary sort of thing, Lady Helena was. And it was quite late when I last saw her at dinner. She was quiet, unusually quiet, if I may say so. Did she mention anything about where she was going, or if she planned to stay out long? Nothing of the sort, Mrs. Cartwright replied quickly, her words tumbling out a little too fast. She just excused herself, said she was feeling a bit tired, that's all. Whimsy's gaze sharpened. There was something off about her account, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the slight tremor in her hands as she folded the handkerchief. She was trying too hard to appear inconspicuous. I see, Whimsy said slowly. And what about the other servants? Anyone else who might have seen something? Mrs. Cartwright's eyes darted briefly to the side, before returning to Whimsy, with an expression that seemed a touch too rehearsed. Oh, I couldn't say, sir. You'd have to speak with the others. They'll have their own accounts, of course, indeed. Whimsy replied, his tone thoughtful. He did not press her further, but his mind was already turning over her words, searching for the nuances hidden in her nervousness. There was something she wasn't telling him, something she was trying to conceal beneath a mask of concern. The next person on Whimsy's list was the butler, Mr. Lockwood, a man of few words but striking composure. He was the kind of servant who never appeared out of place, always maintaining a dignified air that suggested he knew the ways of high society better than most of the aristocracy. The butler was already waiting for them in the parlor, a glass of brandy in hand, his expression carefully neutral. I understand you were on duty last night, Mr. Lockwood, Whimsy said, seating himself across from the man. Can you tell me what you know about Lady Helena's whereabouts? Lockwood's eyes flickered momentarily, but his voice remained steady. Lady Helena? Yes, sir. I believe I saw her leave the dining room after dinner. It was around 9 o'clock, I believe. Quite a peculiar hour to be out in the garden, if you ask me. Peculiar, Whimsy repeated. Why so? The butler's lips twisted into a thin smile. Well, it's not something she usually does. Not that late anyway. She's often in the company of guests, or with her family in the evenings. But last night, it was quite clear she preferred to be alone. She seemed preoccupied. And did you see her leave the house, or did you hear anything unusual? Lockwood shook his head. No, sir, nothing unusual at all. I was attending to other matters in the hall at the time, and I didn't notice her departure. But I assumed she went for a walk, as she often did. And when did you last see her? Whimsy asked, his eyes narrowing. I last saw Lady Helena before the dinner bell. She was in the drawing room with a few of the other guests, but she didn't stay long. Afterward, I went to fetch the post. Whimsy nodded. Though something about the butler's story felt incomplete, there was no urgency in his account, no sign of concern that a woman had gone missing from the manor. Instead, his words were delivered with the detached indifference of someone recounting the events of a day long past. Thank you, Mr. Lockwood. That will be all for now, Whimsy said, his voice polite but dismissive. After leaving the butler's company, Whimsy's thoughts were clouded by the contradictions that had already started to emerge. Mrs. Cartwright had been too eager to point out Lady Helena's quiet demeanor, and Mr. Lockwood's indifference raised more questions than answers. Both had seen her only briefly, and both had been unusually vague about the details. Whimsy then turned his attention to the younger servants, those who might have been in the area. During the critical moments of the evening, he spoke with the chambermaid, a shy girl named Lily, who had been on duty in the servants' hall when the events unfolded. She seemed uncomfortable under Whimsy's questioning, but she had been quick to speak up when asked about Lady Helena's last moments. I remember seeing her by the garden gate, just as I was coming back from the laundry, Lily said, her voice soft but clear. She was standing there, looking up at the sky. She seemed lost, like she was waiting for someone. Waiting for someone, Whimsy repeated, his interest piqued. Did she say anything to you?" Lily shook her head. "No, sir, she didn't say anything, but I thought it strange. She'd never been out so late before, not alone." Whimsy's mind raced, but he did not speak immediately. Lily's account seemed to hint at something more than just a casual stroll through the garden, an intention, perhaps, or a meeting that never occurred. Did she appear upset? Was she in a hurry? Whimsy pressed gently. Lily hesitated. "Not exactly upset, sir, but there was something odd in her eyes, like she was waiting for someone to show up, and then when they didn't she just turned and walked toward the maze, as though it were the next logical step." Whimsy's gaze hardened as the puzzle pieces began to shift into place. Each of the witnesses had offered a slightly different version of the same night, each one providing a small contradiction that hinted at something deeper. The inconsistencies, the hesitation in their voices, and their varied reactions, all of it suggested one thing: someone was lying. The truth was there, buried beneath the layers of deception, but the full picture remained elusive, just out of reach. The more Whimsy uncovered, the clearer it became that the murder was not the only mystery lurking within the walls of Winthorpe Manor. The deeper he dug, the more it seemed that the labyrinth was not merely a physical maze, but a symbol of the tangled web of secrets, lies, and betrayals that had ensnared everyone involved. The morning light filtered weakly through the thick mist that still clung to the grounds of Winthorpe Manor. The house, silent and still, seemed to exhale a cold breath of resignation, as if it, too, felt the weight of the crime that had been committed within its walls. Whimsy stood by the window of his room, staring out over the estate, his mind working through the knots of the case. It was clear now that there was more to Lady Helena's death than a mere act of violence. The labyrinth of deceptions surrounding her murder was far deeper than anyone had anticipated. There were too many pieces to this puzzle, too many possible motives tangled together. Jealousy, greed, revenge, fear. Each of the witnesses had shown their cards, but none of them had laid the whole hand down. Everyone, it seemed, had something to hide. The key to unlocking this mystery was not to look at the murder in isolation, but to understand the relationships, the histories, and the dark currents flowing beneath the surface of Winthorpe Manor. Whimsy's thoughts returned to Lord Winthorpe. The man had seemed odd in his behavior, his defensiveness growing more pronounced as the investigation wore on. But his motives were unclear. Could it have been a crime of passion, a father driven to desperation? It was a possibility, but one Whimsy couldn't quite accept just yet. The Lord was a man who lived by a strict code, and such an action seemed too reckless for him. Then there was Mrs. Cartwright, the housekeeper, whose quickness to deny anything unusual about Lady Helena's behavior had struck Whimsy as too eager, and Mr. Lockwood, the butler, who had spoken with a detached manner, as though his role in the household was nothing more than to act as a passive observer. But it was the servants who had made the deepest impression on him, the younger ones, Lily and the others whose accounts seemed the most genuine, but who also hinted at a deeper, more intimate involvement in the drama. What caught Whimsy's attention, however, was the fact that so many of the people involved seemed to have known more than they let on. Every one of them had a reason to be involved, but no single theory could explain everything. Each time he pulled on one thread of the investigation, it only led to another knot that needed unpicking. His mind shifted to the ring. The copper ring, so tightly clutched in Lady Helena's hand, was still unexplained. Its symbol was too deliberate to be random. It had meaning. Whimsy had spent hours combing through old records and family archives, but so far, the origins of the ring remained a mystery. Whoever had placed it in her hand had been sending a message, perhaps even using the ring as a means to communicate after the crime was committed. The more Whimsy considered the object, the more he realized that the true purpose of the ring was not to be found in its physical form, but in what it represented: a message, a code, a clue that would point him toward the real motive behind Lady Helena's death. He was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Farley, the estate keeper, who entered, his face pale and drawn. "A word, sir," he said, his voice low and anxious. Whimsy waved him in, his mind already whirling with the possible revelations the man might bring. Farley closed the door behind him, then stood for a moment in silence, as if considering how to proceed. "There's something you need to know, sir," Farley began, his voice tight. "Something I've been keeping to myself, but it's clear now that you're looking for answers, and I can't keep this from you any longer." Whimsy's eyes narrowed, sensing that Farley was about to reveal something crucial. "Go on," he urged, his tone steady but intense. "I didn't think it mattered at first," Farley continued, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. "But the night before Lady Helena died, she wasn't just wandering the grounds. She was meeting someone. I saw her, just outside the garden wall, talking to a man." "A man," Whimsy repeated, his interest piqued. Farley nodded. "Yes, I didn't recognize him, but I saw the two of them talking." Lady Helena was agitated. She looked as though she were arguing with him. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but there was something about her expression. It wasn't just a casual conversation. "Did you see the man clearly?" Whimsy pressed, his mind already racing through the possible suspects. Farley shook his head. "No, sir, it was too dark, and I didn't want to be seen. But I swear, something was off. They weren't just talking. I think she was trying to keep it hidden." Whimsy stood still for a moment, his thoughts racing. Who was the man? Why had Lady Helena been meeting with someone at such an hour? And why had Farley waited until now to mention it? "Why didn't you come forward sooner, Farley?" Whimsy asked, his voice softer now, though the suspicion lingered in his tone. "I wasn't sure if it meant anything," Farley admitted, his eyes darting nervously toward the window. "But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed important. I didn't want to make a mistake, not with everything going on." Whimsy nodded, his expression unreadable. "You've done the right thing by telling me. Now, I need you to think carefully. What did the man look like? Anything at all that might help me identify him." Farley took a deep breath, his eyes squeezing shut as he tried to recall the details. "He was tall, I think. Thin, but not too thin. He had a cloak, dark, heavy, something that would have kept him warm. That's all I remember. It wasn't much, but I could tell that there was something about him that didn't fit in with the rest of the staff." Whimsy considered this new piece of information carefully. A man meeting with Lady Helena in secret, late at night. The possibility of a clandestine affair. A secret, or something more sinister. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed that Lady Helena had been involved in something far beyond the confines of her family's expectations. The question now was, who had she been meeting, and why? Whimsy dismissed Farley, his mind still churning with the latest revelations. As he paced back and forth in the room, he returned to the one thread that seemed to tie everything together: the ring. There had to be more to it, something he had missed in his earlier inspection. The ring had been placed in Lady Helena's hand after she had died, almost as though someone wanted to ensure that she would be remembered, or perhaps that the truth would be passed on, even in death. He returned to the library and began flipping through the old family records once more. The symbols on the ring had to mean something. Perhaps they were a clue to an old debt, an unspoken agreement between two people long forgotten. And there it was, buried deep in the annals of Winthorpe history, a reference to an old financial transaction between the Winthorpe family and a now-deceased relative. A relative who had once worked closely with the manor's estate manager. A relative who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances many years ago. It was a thread, a tenuous one, but one that could unravel everything. Whimsy leaned back, deep in thought. The labyrinth of motives, greed, jealousy, betrayal was slowly becoming clear, but it was still too complex to understand in full. The pieces were falling into place, but there were still so many questions left unanswered. Each suspect, each witness, each new revelation pointed in a different direction, but no single theory could explain it all. The maze of deception, like the maze outside, was far from solved, but Whimsy was getting closer. He could feel it. The day had begun to wear on. The quiet hum of the manor, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind outside. The investigation had stretched on long enough to make everyone on edge. But Whimsy could feel the tide beginning to turn. He had uncovered a significant lead, one that, for all intents and purposes, should have led him to the truth. And yet, as he sat alone in the study, the sense of satisfaction he should have felt eluded him. There was something about the whole affair that didn't quite sit right, a sensation he couldn't shake, a feeling that there was still something lurking beneath the surface, just out of reach. The breakthrough had come only hours before. It was Farley, the estate keeper, whose earlier confession about seeing Lady Helena meet a mysterious man had been dismissed as merely circumstantial, but Wimsey had taken another look at the estate's financial records and, through a series of delicate inquiries, had uncovered something unexpected, a hidden ledger, one that had been conveniently tucked away in a forgotten cabinet, which detailed a series of clandestine payments made to a man named Nathaniel Quinn, a man who had once been involved in a failed business venture with Lord Winthrop, a name that seemed to be woven through the estate's history, one that carried with it whispers of betrayal and lost fortunes. The payments, it seemed, had stopped only recently, months before Lady Helena's death, and they were not merely business transactions. No, these payments were more personal, as though Lord Winthrop had been keeping something from his family, a secret relationship of sorts. The detective's pulse quickened as he pieced the puzzle together. Nathaniel Quinn had been close to the Winthrop family many years ago, but after a sudden falling out, he had disappeared. The connection between him and Lady Helena, however, remained unclear. What had brought them together, and what had caused the rift between Quinn and the family? There was no doubt now. The ledger pointed directly to Quinn, and the discovery was enough to make the authorities jump to conclusions. By evening, the manor was abuzz with excitement. The police had gathered enough evidence to justify an arrest. The case, it seemed, was all but solved. Lord Winthrop, upon hearing the news, looked momentarily relieved, as though the burden of suspicion had finally been lifted from his shoulders. But Wimsey wasn't convinced. The authorities rushed to make their announcement, and soon the manor was filled with whispers of a breakthrough. The detectives, led by Inspector Darnell, were quick to announce that Nathaniel Quinn was the prime suspect, the payments revealing a financial connection that could have easily turned into something more sinister. With their man identified, the case appeared solved, and the investigation was officially brought to a close. It was a victory, or at least it seemed to be. Wimsey, however, stood apart from the crowd, watching the proceedings with a wary eye. The authorities were so eager to declare the case closed, but the truth of the matter didn't sit right with him. Something in the story still didn't add up. Quinn's sudden appearance, his payments, the motive, all of it was too neat, too convenient. It felt too much like a carefully orchestrated conclusion, as if someone had planned for this exact outcome. And then there was the ring, the copper ring that Lady Helena had clutched so tightly. It remained the single most baffling piece of evidence. Why had she held onto it with such intensity? What connection did it have to her death? Could Quinn have been the one to place it in her hand, knowing that it would point directly to him? Or was there something more to the story that had yet to be revealed? That night, as the manor settled into an uneasy silence, Wimsey found himself pacing the length of the study, his mind working through the tangled threads of the case once more. It wasn't just about solving the murder, it was about understanding the motive, the true reason behind the crime. And right now, he was no closer to the truth than he had been when he first stepped into the manor. The breakthrough with Quinn was too simple, too easy. The case had started with a maze, both physical and psychological, and yet now it felt as though the puzzle had been solved in a single move, too cleanly to be real. It was as though someone had been guiding him toward this conclusion, drawing him down the wrong path, making him see only what they wanted him to see. Wimsey stopped pacing and walked over to the desk. The ledger still lay there, the damning evidence against Quinn, but he couldn't bring himself to trust it fully. There were too many loose ends, too many contradictions. The way Farley had described the encounter with Lady Helena and the mysterious man, it had felt too casual, too insignificant in the grand scheme of things, and yet it held the key to something that didn't quite fit into the neatly packaged narrative being presented. It was then that the detective's thoughts turned back to Lord Winthrop. The man had been so quick to dismiss the possibility of anyone else being involved, so ready to embrace Quinn as the guilty party. Was it because the truth was already too dangerous for him to confront? Could it be that Lord Winthrop had something to hide, something far more significant than financial dealings with a man he no longer cared for? Whimsy knew he needed to confront the Lord, but not just yet. He had to be sure. He needed one final piece to make the picture clear. As the clock struck midnight, Whimsy decided to take one last walk through the garden, to the very place where Lady Helena had been found. The path was eerily quiet, the air thick with mist, the moonlight reflecting off the twisted hedgerows of the maze. The garden was a place of secrets, a place where the past seemed to linger, hiding in the shadows. Whimsy stood at the entrance to the maze, staring at the darkened pathways that stretched before him. He could almost feel the weight of Lady Helena's death in the air, the unanswered questions swirling around him like the fog that clung to the ground. It was then that something caught his eye, a flash of metal in the moonlight, glinting just beneath the overgrown branches of a nearby tree. Whimsy's heart skipped a beat as he crouched down to examine it. It was another ring, a different one this time, far more intricate than the first. The design was similar, but the markings were different, more detailed, as though it held a different kind of significance. The discovery sent a chill through Whimsy's spine. The piece of evidence he had been waiting for was right in front of him. But this wasn't the breakthrough he had expected. It was something far darker, something that suggested the case had only just begun, that the maze was not the only thing hiding secrets. And now, more than ever, Whimsy knew that the false victory the authorities had claimed was just the beginning of a much more dangerous game. The real criminal, it seemed, was still in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The discovery of the second ring, the one hidden in the shadows beneath the tree, had unsettled Whimsy more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the ring itself. Though it was an unusual and perplexing object, it was the realization that something much deeper lay beneath the surface of Lady Helena's death. The sense of unease gnawed at him as he walked back through the misty garden. The second ring still in his pocket. It wasn't just another clue. It was an echo of something older, something long forgotten. He returned to the study, where the lamp's flickering light illuminated the traces of a long night, spent searching for meaning in the maze of lies and half-truths that surrounded him. The case had spiraled in too many directions, but one thing had become clear to him now. The key to understanding Lady Helena's death did not lie in the present alone. There were old, buried connections, ties between the people involved that no one had considered. And the further he delved into the history of the Winthrop family and its ties to Nathaniel Quinn, the more certain he became that the crime wasn't a recent betrayal, but the culmination of a much older, deeper wound. The second ring, with its intricate design and slightly different markings, seemed to speak of secrets that went far beyond the financial dealings Lord Winthrop had tried to bury. It wasn't just about the business dispute. No, it was something more personal, something rooted in a history that had been hidden from the family, perhaps even deliberately erased. As Whimsy sat back in his chair, he began to sift through the Winthrop archives again. His fingers moved over dusty tomes and crumbling ledgers, the records of a family whose history, on the surface, seemed unremarkable. But something had caught his eye, a mention of a long-forgotten scandal that had occurred nearly 2 decades before. It was a brief entry, buried within the details of an old legal dispute, but it contained a name that stood out like a bright red flag: Margaret Winthrop. Margaret was the late wife of Lord Winthrop, and it seemed that her name had been strangely absent from any conversation about the family's past. The marriage had been marked by tragedy. Margaret had died under mysterious circumstances when Lady Helena was still a young child, but the records surrounding her death had always been unclear, shrouded in ambiguity. It had been ruled an accident, an unfortunate fall, but there had always been a lingering suspicion among certain members of the household that there was more to her death than met the eye. Whimsy's eyes narrowed as he read the passage again. It was clear now: Margaret Winthrop had not died by accident. She had been murdered. The realization sent a chill through him. He had been so focused on the present, on the web of deceit surrounding Lady Helena's death, that he had overlooked the shadow of the past. Margaret's death had been a crucial turning point in the family's history, a moment that had been carefully swept under the rug. And now, it seemed, it was all coming back to haunt them. There was one person who had known the full truth about Margaret Winthorpe's death, Nathaniel Quinn. The same Nathaniel Quinn who had once been involved in a business venture with Lord Winthorpe. The same man who had been involved in the recent payments to the family. But Quinn's connection to the Winthorpes didn't end there. He had been deeply intertwined with Margaret. Before her death, so much so that it had caused a scandal at the time. A rumor, long suppressed, had suggested that Quinn had been more than just a business partner to Margaret, that they had been lovers, and that Margaret's death had not been an accident at all. Wimsey's mind reeled as he pieced this together. It was no longer just about the present-day family dispute. It was about a crime that had been covered up for years, and a love affair that had turned deadly. Margaret had known something. Perhaps she had discovered something about Lord Winthorpe's finances, or perhaps she had found out about a more personal betrayal, but whatever it was, it had led to her death. And now Nathaniel Quinn had returned to Winthorpe Manor, not as a distant relative or business partner, but as someone with a far darker agenda. The connection between Quinn and the Winthorpes had been buried for years, but the truth was coming. Too late now, piece by piece. And the second ring, the one found in the garden, seemed to serve as a signal that someone, perhaps even Quinn himself, was trying to resurrect the past. Wimsey knew that he couldn't let this trail go cold. He needed to confront Lord Winthorpe again, to dig deeper into the history of his family. But this time, the investigation had to be handled carefully. If the Lord had been involved in his wife's murder, whether directly or indirectly, it would explain a great deal about his willingness to protect the family's reputation at all costs. And it would also explain why he had been so eager to point the finger at Quinn. Before he could make his move, however, there was something else that had to be addressed. The family's staff. The butler, Lockwood, had remained strangely tight-lipped throughout the investigation. His aloof demeanor had initially been dismissed as the natural detachment of a servant. But Wimsey had begun to wonder if Lockwood knew more than he let on. Was he merely a passive observer, or was there something more sinister in his role at Winthorpe Manor? Wimsey decided to pay Lockwood a visit, under the guise of making a casual inquiry about the ongoing investigation. As he entered the butler's quarters, he noted the man's sudden tension. Lockwood's back straightened the moment he stepped inside, and his eyes flickered toward the door, as though assessing whether anyone might overhear their conversation. "Ah, Lord Wimsey," Lockwood said in his usual impassive tone. "What brings you to my humble domain?" Wimsey took a seat in front of him, carefully choosing his words. "I wanted to follow up on a few things. We've made some headway with the case, but there are still certain details that aren't quite adding up. Your observations may prove helpful." Lockwood nodded, though Wimsey noticed the way his fingers twitched nervously at his side. "Of course, sir. I'll do my best to assist." Wimsey studied the butler for a moment before speaking again. "I've been looking into the history of the Winthorpe family, and I came across something interesting, something that ties the past to the present. I wonder if you might know anything about a certain incident, Margaret Winthorpe's death." Lockwood's expression faltered for just a moment, a fleeting hesitation that quickly dissolved into his usual poise. "I'm afraid I can't be of much help there, sir. That was long before my time." "Really?" Wimsey asked, his voice casual, though his eyes never left Lockwood's face. "I find it curious, considering your position in the household. You must have heard whispers, rumors at the very least." Lockwood's gaze remained steady, but there was something in his posture, the stiffness of his shoulders, that suggested he was holding back. "There are always rumors, sir. But what is it you wish to know?" Wimsey leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more measured tone. "I believe there's more to Margaret Winthorpe's death than anyone realizes, and I believe you might know something about it. Perhaps a detail, something that might link her death to the events that followed. I'm not here to accuse you, Lockwood, but I am looking for the truth, for Lady Helena's sake." Lockwood swallowed visibly, his throat working as he seemed to struggle with the words he had been withholding. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice low and tinged with something like fear. "Margaret wasn't just a wife," he murmured. "She was a woman who knew too much, and sometimes, sir, knowing too much can be fatal." Wimsey's heart skipped a beat. The shadows of the past had begun to emerge, and with them, The tangled web of secrets that had led to this very moment. The past, it seemed, was not so easily forgotten. Wimsey stood in the dimly lit hallway, his fingers brushing lightly against the walls of Winthorpe Manor, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath his touch. His mind was a swirl of thoughts, each one pushing him further into a corner, a web of lies and half-remembered truths that seemed to close in with each passing moment. There was something he had overlooked, something small and subtle, but powerful, in its potential to shift the course of the investigation. He had seen it before: the slight twitch of a hand, the involuntary glance toward the window, the hesitant breath before a seemingly casual answer. These were the things that revealed the cracks in the perfect facade. The butler, Lockwood, had given him more than he had realized. There had been an undeniable flicker in his eyes when Margaret Winthorpe's name had been mentioned. That hesitation, that instant where the world had momentarily stopped for him, told Wimsey everything he needed to know. Lockwood knew more than he was letting on, and if the butler knew something, there was a chance that others in the household did too. They just needed to be pushed gently, but firmly, until the truth began to surface like oil rising to the top of water. Wimsey wasn't one to rely solely on brute force. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most effective way to extract a confession was through subtlety, through observation, and through knowing precisely how to manipulate a situation to make the truth impossible to ignore. And tonight, he would employ just such a method. The household was abuzz with activity as the day drew to a close. Lord Winthorpe had retired to his study, while Mrs. Cartwright, the housekeeper, moved between the kitchens and dining room, her face taut with the stress of the ongoing investigation. The servants, meanwhile, worked in nervous silence, casting furtive glances at one another. No one seemed quite themselves, not since the breakthrough with Nathaniel Quinn, and certainly not since Wimsey's quiet probing had begun to peel back the layers of their carefully constructed facades. Wimsey waited, watching, as the shadows of the manor deepened. He knew what he needed to do. It was time for the unusual tactic, one that would draw out not just the truth, but the fear behind it. The truth had a way of revealing itself when someone was made to confront it in an unexpected way, and tonight it would be Lord Winthorpe's turn to be tested. He made his way to the study, where the Lord had taken refuge. The door was slightly ajar, and Wimsey could see the silhouette of Lord Winthorpe hunched over his desk, scribbling in a ledger. He knocked gently, but firmly, before entering. Lord Winthorpe, he began, his voice calm, almost too calm. "I trust I'm not disturbing you." The Lord looked up from his writing, his face pale, and his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He gave a tight smile. "Not at all, Wimsey. What can I do for you?" Wimsey stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. "I've been thinking about the case, about the circumstances surrounding Lady Helena's death. I'm afraid I've come to a rather troubling conclusion." The Lord's expression shifted slightly, his hand faltering in mid-motion. "Troubling?" he repeated, his voice laced with a thin veneer of concern. "What sort of conclusion?" "I've been looking at the family's past," Wimsey continued, taking a deliberate step closer to the desk, his voice low. "The connections, the events leading up to Lady Helena's death, and, well, something struck me." He paused, watching the Lord's reaction. "There are certain patterns I've seen before in other cases, and it's led me to believe that the murder may not be as simple as we've been led to believe." The Lord's grip tightened on his pen, his knuckles going white. Wimsey saw it, the subtle shift in posture, the tightening of the jaw. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, but Wimsey knew it for what it was: fear. "I don't quite understand what you mean," Lord Winthorpe replied, his voice a little strained. "We know who did it, don't we? We've already identified the person responsible." Wimsey tilted his head slightly, allowing a small smile to play at the edges of his lips. "Yes, of course, Nathaniel Quinn. But there's something else, isn't there? Something that doesn't sit right with you." Lord Winthorpe froze, his eyes locking onto Wimsey's with an intensity that seemed to measure him, as if deciding whether or not to trust him with something unspeakable. His hand trembled slightly as it hovered over his desk. You've discovered something, haven't you?" the Lord finally asked, his voice lowering. What is it you're implying?" Whimsy leaned in closer, his voice barely above. A whisper. "I'm implying that Nathaniel Quinn may not be the only person involved. In fact, I believe he's merely a pawn in a much larger game. The truth, Lord Winthrop, lies deeper than any of us realize. It's buried beneath a layer of lies and old family secrets, and I think you know it." The Lord's eyes flickered, a brief moment of indecision crossing his face, but then something in him seemed to snap, as though a wall that had stood firm for years was finally starting to crumble. He dropped his pen with a quiet clatter and sat back in his chair, a look of exhaustion settling on his features. "I knew it wouldn't take long for you to figure it out," he said, his voice tinged with something bitter regret, perhaps, or resignation. "You're right. There's more to this than just Nathaniel Quinn. But what you don't understand is that you're not looking in the right place." Whimsy's heart beat faster, but he kept his expression neutral. "And where, precisely, should I be looking, Lord?" Winthrop sighed heavily, his gaze drifting toward the window as though the very question weighed too heavily on him. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was Margaret. She knew too much. She was going to ruin everything, but I never meant for it to go that far. I never meant for her to die. Whimsy remained still, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. Margaret Winthrop, his wife, the woman who had died under mysterious circumstances all those years ago, the one who had been erased from the family's history, hidden away, swept under the rug. You killed her?" Whimsy asked softly, his voice low and steady, but with an edge of disbelief. Lord Winthrop's face twisted in a grimace of self-loathing. "No, not me. It wasn't supposed to be me. But I was involved. I was complicit. And when it all came to light, I knew I had to protect my family. I had to protect my name. I thought if I could just bury the past, bury Margaret, then everything would be fine. But Lady Helena was too much like her mother, too inquisitive. She started to ask questions." Whimsy felt the weight of the moment settle around him. "So, you arranged it all. You covered up Margaret's death. And now, you think that by pointing the finger at Nathaniel Quinn, you can keep the past from resurfacing." The Lord nodded, his face pale, his eyes sunken with the weight of guilt. "I had no choice. I couldn't let it come out. Not now, not after all these years. But it's all unraveling, isn't it? I thought I could control it, but you've seen through everything." Whimsy paused, taking in the Lord's confession. It was the truth, but it was also a confession laden with so much manipulation and deceit that it left a bitter taste in his mouth. And yet, there was something deeper here, something more intricate than Lord Winthrop was letting on. He stood up, his eyes never leaving the Lord. "You've given me much to think about, Lord Winthrop, but I still believe there's more to this than you realize, more that you're not telling me." Lord Winthrop's eyes flickered with panic. "You don't know what you're getting into, Whimsy. I've done everything to protect my family. But now there are forces at play that you can't even begin to understand." Whimsy gave him a faint smile, his voice calm as ever. "Perhaps, but I intend to find out, and I'll make sure the past doesn't stay buried this time." As he turned to leave the room, the weight of Lord Winthrop's confession settled heavily on his shoulders. The cracks in the facade were widening, and the deeper he dug, the more dangerous this puzzle became. The Lord had revealed a crucial piece, but it was far from the final answer. The real story was far darker, and Whimsy had only just begun to unravel the web of lies. The manor seemed quieter than usual, its corridors echoing with a silence that felt heavy, almost suffocating. Whimsy stood at the top of the staircase, looking down at the sweeping marble floor below, his mind still spinning from Lord Winthrop's confession. He had known, on some level, that the secrets of the Winthrop family ran deep, but hearing it directly from the source had turned those shadows into something palpable, something real and dangerous. He couldn't help but wonder just how far the Lord's complicity stretched. He had admitted to being involved in Margaret's death, but had he truly been the only one? The more Whimsy thought about it, the more pieces seemed to be missing. But there was no time to dwell on that now. He had a responsibility to uncover the full truth, and that meant pushing forward, not resting on the half-revelations he had so far. The night had stretched on into the early hours of the morning, and the manor was quiet to quiet. Whimsy had already made arrangements to meet with his team to re-examine the evidence, particularly the ledger he had discovered earlier. But a lingering feeling of dread weighed heavily on him. It was the kind of feeling you got when you were certain that something was about to go wrong, even though you couldn't quite place why. He had seen it before, an investigation on the verge of unraveling, a crucial piece just within reach, only to have it slip away at the last moment. He descended the stairs slowly, as though each step took him deeper into the heart of the mystery. His mind drifted back to the ring, the one found in the garden, and the second ring, which seemed to tie back to Margaret Winthrop. That was where everything had started to converge, a symbol of a past buried in deceit, hidden connections, and unanswered questions. But something was wrong. His instinct screamed at him as he turned the corner toward the study, his pulse quickening. The door was slightly ajar. The faintest sound reached his ears, a soft scrape of metal against wood. A barely audible click, like the sound of a drawer being pulled open and shut. He froze. Every sense alert. He pushed the door open, the hinges creaking slightly, and stepped inside. The study was still, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that ran down his spine. The desk was as he had left it, papers scattered, a few books open, the ledger he had been studying lying on top, partially closed. But something was off. The drawer. It was slightly open. Whimsy approached it cautiously, his heart racing. He reached down and opened it fully. A cold wave of realization sweeping over him. The ledger, the one that had contained the payments to Nathaniel Quinn, the one that had detailed the financial transactions that tied the Winthrop family to decades of secrets, was gone. His first thought was that it had been misplaced, but he quickly ruled that out. It had been in this drawer only hours ago when he had left. It had been here, with all its damning evidence, and now it was gone. Someone had taken it. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes darting from one corner to the next, searching for anything out of place. The study looked the same as it always did, familiar, unremarkable except for the missing ledger. A sense of cold fury began to settle in his chest, but it was quickly replaced by a creeping sense of danger. This was no accident. Someone had been in here, someone who didn't want the truth to come to light. The question was who. He turned on his heel and rushed back toward the hall, making for the staircase. He needed to get to the staff quarters, to find out who had been in the study, who had had access to the room. But just as he reached the landing, a soft voice halted him in his tracks, looking for something. Lord Whimsy. It was Mrs. Cartwright, standing at the base of the stairs, her eyes sharp and calculating, her face unreadable. Her appearance was no surprise. She had been the one to handle much of the household's affairs, the one who knew the movements of the staff better than anyone. But something in her expression gave Whimsy pause. He faltered, suddenly aware that any excuse he made would sound contrived. I believe there's been some mischief. She nodded, her lips curling slightly into a smile. Mischief? Yes, we wouldn't want that now, would we? Whimsy eyed her closely, his mind already racing through the possibilities. Mrs. Cartwright had been far too eager to play the role of the perfect housekeeper, hiding behind her efficient, composed demeanor. She was too polished, too controlled. She had something to hide. I need to speak with the staff, he said, his voice firm. I need to know who's been near the study recently. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she spoke again, her tone unnervingly soft. Of course, Lord Whimsy. But be careful. Sometimes the truth is buried so deep, it's easier to leave it alone, for everyone's sake. Her words hung in the air as she turned and walked away, her steps silent as she faded into the shadows of the hall. Whimsy stood still for a moment, the weight of her cryptic statement sinking in. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Someone, perhaps even someone within the household, had acted with purpose, with the intent to derail the investigation. And now, that person was trying to guide him off course, playing a game of manipulation. His hand tightened around the railing as he made his way down the stairs, his mind racing through every interaction, every face he had seen in the past few days. Who had the most to lose from the truth? Who had the ability to reach into the study and take the evidence? He found his way to the staff quarters, his footsteps echoing down the dimly lit corridor. He He knew he had to be careful now. Trust was a fragile thing, and with each passing moment, it seemed that the very foundation of the investigation was starting to crack. The staff was gathered in the common room, talking in low voices, their eyes darting nervously as Whimsy entered. They fell silent the moment he stepped inside, and their expressions, a mixture of guilt and unease, told him everything he needed to know. "I need to know who's been in the study," Whimsy said again, his voice commanding. "Someone has taken something that doesn't belong to them, and I need to know who." The silence in the room grew thicker, the air heavy with suspicion. Then, slowly, Lily, one of the younger maids, spoke up, her voice shaking. "I don't know anything about it, sir," she stammered. "I haven't been near the study." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "Anyone else?" The room shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Mrs. Cartwright had managed to build a wall of silence around the staff, and now Whimsy found himself staring at a collection of faces that seemed to hide more than they revealed. He needed to go deeper. This wasn't just about finding the missing evidence anymore. This was about exposing the lengths to which someone would go to bury the truth. "I'll need to question everyone," he said, his voice cold. "And I'll start with you, Mrs. Cartwright." Her eyes flickered for just a moment, and Whimsy saw it, an almost imperceptible flash of fear. For a fleeting instant, she wasn't the composed housekeeper anymore. She was something else entirely. As Whimsy stepped closer, ready to begin the real questioning, the air seemed to thicken with the sense that the battle for the truth had only just begun. The stakes had risen higher than ever. Someone was working against him, and this time, the game had changed. Whimsy didn't wait for the staff to scatter. He already knew what he needed to do. The room was too tense, too thick with suspicion for any answers to come easily, and his patience was beginning to wear thin. Every word from Mrs. Cartwright, every awkward shift of the staff's eyes, only further convinced him that something was deeply wrong here. The ledger, the crucial piece of evidence that had tied the Winthorpes to Nathaniel Quinn, was gone, and that could not be a coincidence. He made his way toward Mrs. Cartwright, who had remained strangely silent since his demand to know who had accessed the study. She stood stiffly at the back of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, her lips pressed into a thin line. The brief flicker of fear in her eyes earlier hadn't escaped him, and now he could see it again. She was hiding something. Wimsey stopped just a few paces from her, his gaze steady. "You're being uncooperative, Mrs. Cartwright. That's a dangerous thing for someone in your position." She raised an eyebrow, her composure almost to perfect. "I'm only doing what I've been instructed to, Lord Whimsy. This household is my responsibility, and I'm not accustomed to being questioned by anyone outside of the family." Her words were calculated, a subtle threat cloaked in polite deflection, but Whimsy wasn't fooled. He needed to push harder. "You know who's been in the study. You know who has the most to lose from the truth coming out. And I suspect you've been playing a part in keeping things buried." His voice was low, steady, but there was a bite to it now. He wasn't asking anymore. Her lips parted, then closed again, as if she were carefully weighing her options. For a moment, the only sound was the distant murmur of the other staff members in the common room, nervously shifting in place. "You don't know the full picture, Lord Whimsy," she finally said, her voice suddenly softer, almost conspiratorial. "There are things that go back much further than you can possibly imagine. If you keep digging, if you keep stirring up old secrets, you'll destroy everyone in this house. The Winthorpes, the staff, even yourself." Whimsy's gaze didn't falter. "I don't care about destroying anyone, Mrs. Cartwright. I care about the truth, and I intend to find it, no matter how many layers of lies you try to hide it under." Her expression tightened again, the fragile veneer of civility cracking just slightly. But before she could respond, a loud noise came from behind them, a crash, followed by a sharp shout. Whimsy spun on his heel and bolted for the source of the noise, his heart racing. He found Lily, the young maid, standing over a broken vase, a trail of water pooling across the floor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I was just cleaning, and it slipped out of my hands." Whimsy's gaze flicked from the broken vase to Lily, then to the staff gathered in the room. watching the scene unfold. There was something in the way they all stood, watching, waiting, that sent a chill down his spine. Was this a distraction? A deliberate attempt to pull him away from something more important? "Clean it up and make sure it doesn't happen again," he said sharply. Though his mind was already on something else, he turned to Mrs. Cartwright, who was watching the exchange. With an unreadable expression, "You know what this is, don't you?" he said, his voice low and threatening. "This is a diversion, a trick. Someone's playing games with me." Mrs. Cartwright didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at Lily, then back at Wimsey, her lips curling into a thin smile. "You're quite perceptive, Lord Wimsey. It's not often that someone can see the strings pulling everything together." He didn't give her the chance to continue. Without another word, he turned and marched out of the common room, making his way to the study once more. He couldn't afford to waste another second. The ledger was gone. But it wasn't just the ledger that mattered. There were more pieces to this puzzle, and he had to find them before they vanished too. Back in the study, Wimsey immediately began. Searching again, his eyes darted over the room, cataloging every detail with a sharp, practiced gaze. He could feel the weight of the missing evidence pressing down on him like a wall closing in. There had to be something here, some sign that someone had made a mistake, some overlooked clue that would reveal who was behind the theft. He ran his hands over the desk, feeling for any hidden compartments or signs of tampering. Nothing. He moved to the bookshelves, scanning the titles one by one, mentally cataloging each one as he went. It was an exercise in patience, but it was also his only option then. Just as his frustration was beginning to mount, his eye caught something, a small piece of paper, wedged between two books on the middle shelf, almost entirely hidden from view. His fingers twitched as he pulled it free, his pulse quickening. The paper was torn at the edges, and the ink was smudged, but the writing was legible. It was a list of names he recognized: Lord Winthrop, Nathaniel Quinn, Margaret Winthrop, but there were others too. Names of people who had never been mentioned in connection to the family before. People from the past, people who had disappeared. Wimsey's heart began to race as he scanned the names. There were also numbers, dates, figures, and cryptic references to debts, payments, and arrangements. The ink was faint, suggesting it had been written some time ago, but the urgency in the message was clear. This was more than just a ledger. This was the key to understanding the connections, the deals that had been struck in the dark corners of the Winthrop family's history. His mind worked quickly as he pieced it together. Someone had wanted this information gone. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase it from the records, to make sure it was buried. But now, it was in his hands. The very piece of evidence he had been searching for had been hidden right under his nose. But as he studied the paper further, his stomach dropped. The names and numbers weren't just historical, they were current. Someone had been paying off individuals recently, people involved in the old family scandal. It was clear now, the theft of the ledger wasn't an isolated incident. Someone had been watching, waiting for the right moment to remove the one thing that would bring everything to light. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. There was someone inside the house, someone who was orchestrating this entire cover-up, manipulating the staff, and pulling the strings behind the scenes. And they weren't going to stop until the entire truth had been buried for good. Wimsey clenched his fists, a new determination flooding his veins. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore, it was about exposing a conspiracy, one that went far deeper than he had ever imagined. And now, with this paper in his hand, he had the first real evidence he needed to bring everything crashing down. But the game had changed. Trust had become a fragile thing, and as he stood there in the study, staring at the cryptic list of names and payments, Wimsey knew that the stakes had never been higher. Someone was working against him, and this time, they would stop at nothing to make sure the truth stayed buried. Wimsey stood in the quiet of the study, the worn scrap of paper trembling slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the electric thrill of recognition. He hadn't been wrong to suspect the deeper rot within Winthrop Manor, nor to assume that someone had been systematically working to destroy the trail of truth. But now, for the first time in days, he felt the dust settling just enough for something solid to emerge. The stolen ledger might be gone, but this hastily hidden fragment spoke louder than the volumes that had been erased. He lowered himself into the chair by the desk, the heavy silence pressing around him. On the list were names from the past, yes, but not just any names. Some had been involved with the estate, distant cousins, former staff, even a solicitor who had once handled the inheritance disputes after Margaret Winthorpe's death. Others had no obvious connection, but 3 of the names had asterisks beside them, and that was where Whimsy's attention now lay. One of them was Nathaniel Quinn. Another was Mrs. Cartwright. The third, Lysander Gray, he didn't recognize. He sat back, his brow furrowing. The asterisks had to signify importance. Either these people were being paid to remain silent, or they were involved in orchestrating the silence themselves. Either way, the pattern was beginning to take shape. Someone had invested time and effort into ensuring certain individuals were protected or silenced, and that someone had failed to account for a single, fatal weakness: human error. He scanned the list again, then turned his gaze to the bookshelf. It was a detail that had nagged at him since the start. The ring, the one found in the garden. At first, he'd thought it was Lady Helena's, a misplaced trinket. Then it had appeared to belong to Margaret. But what if it had never belonged to either of them? He stood abruptly and crossed to the collection of portraits in the adjoining corridor. Most were faded with age, lacquered in dust, the eyes of long-dead Winthorpes peering down with dignified indifference. But their third from the left was a portrait he hadn't studied closely before. A young man, solemn and angular, with a faint resemblance to Lord Winthorpe. Beneath the frame, a plaque read, Lysander Gray, 1897 to 1922. Whimsy stared at it. Lysander, the third name with an asterisk. He turned back toward the study, thoughts colliding rapidly in his mind. Gray, Margaret Winthorpe's maiden name, had been Gray. He remembered it from the faded marriage certificate he'd briefly glimpsed while searching through the family's documents earlier. Lysander had been her brother Margaret's brother, which made him Lord Winthorpe's brother-in-law, and according to the dates, he had died young at 25. So why was his name on a list that had been updated recently? He moved quickly, now, retrieving his notes and cross-referencing everything he had gathered about Margaret's background. She had come from a respectable, if not particularly wealthy, family. Her brother Lysander had reportedly died during an expedition abroad, a fever or an accident, depending on which family member was telling the story. But none of it had added up. There had been no grave, no obituary, no record of his death filed with the registry. If Lysander hadn't died in 1922, where had he gone? Whimsy paced, the carpet muffling his footfalls. An idea began to form, wild at first, but then increasingly logical as he followed its threads. What if Lysander hadn't died, but had been exiled, forced out of the picture because he knew too much? Perhaps he'd discovered something about the Winthorpe family's dealings, or about Margaret's death, or even about her true fate. Perhaps he'd tried to act, and for that, he'd been removed. And if he was alive, could he be the one manipulating events now from the shadows? No. Whimsy stopped himself. That felt too clean. More likely, someone had used his name. It was a code, a signal between co-conspirators. The name Lysander Gray had been repurposed, perhaps as an alias, perhaps to signify a ghost that still haunted the family. And suddenly, an offhand comment from earlier that day rang in his ears. It had come from Lily when she was apologizing for the broken vase. She had muttered something almost unintelligible at the time. I thought it was his again. The gray man. Whimsy had taken it for rambling, a nervous slip. But now it took on new weight. He returned to the common room, where the staff had dispersed, leaving only the youngest maid curled up on a bench, trying to sleep. He sat beside her gently. Lily, he said softly, her eyes opened, red and puffy. You mentioned something earlier about the gray man. Do you remember? She blinked slowly, then nodded. Yes, I saw him once, at the edge of the orchard, months ago. I thought it was just one of the tenants from the village, but he looked just like the painting in the hall, the one with the sad eyes. Lysander Gray. Whimsy asked. She hesitated. Is that his name? I didn't know. I've only seen him twice, but he always disappears before anyone else can see. Whimsy's heart began to beat harder. Either someone was impersonating Lysander, or someone who looked enough like him to unsettle the staff had returned to Winthorpe Land. For the first time in decades, he rose quickly and left Lily to rest. Heading straight to the west wing, the disused wing of the manor, long shuttered, and supposedly abandoned after Margaret's death. If someone were hiding here, using the estate itself as cover, that would be the only place left unexamined. As he passed through the long, musty hallway, he noted the dust undisturbed at first, then subtly disrupted, a trail, barely visible in the moonlight streaming through the narrow windows, footprints, not boots, but shoes, recently worn, leading directly to one of the old servants' staircases. Whimsy's breath slowed as he crept forward. The air in this part of the house was cold, but not the dead cold of disuse. It carried warmth, a faint trace of life, and that was when he saw it, a light, quickly extinguished, from under the door at the end of the corridor. He moved slowly now, silently, until he reached the door. There, he waited. One beat, two. He knocked once, sharply. Nothing. Then, a creak. The latch turned from the inside. And when the door opened, the man who stood before him bore a face Whimsy had seen only once in that portrait in the corridor. Older now, weathered, with sorrow etched deep into every line of his face. Lysander Gray. Whimsy didn't speak, not yet. Not until he knew what part this ghost from the past had played. But in that instant, the final shape of the pattern began to emerge, complex, tragic, and perfectly consistent. The answers had always been here, in plain sight, hidden, like Lysander himself, behind years of silence and grief. Whimsy stood still, his breath barely audible in the quiet hallway as the door to the west wing creaked open, revealing the man who had haunted the edges of this investigation for days. Lysander Gray, alive, though time had ravaged him, stood before him, his eyes worn but sharp, a ghost that had never truly left the manor. There was no immediate explanation, no grand reveal, just the silent tension that hung between them, a thread pulling taut with every heartbeat. Lysander's face, half lit by the dim glow from the single candle on the nearby table, was an unreadable mask. His hair was graying at the temples, his features gaunt, but the likeness to the portrait in the hallway was unmistakable. Lysander Gray. Whimsy finally spoke, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. I had a feeling, but I never expected. The man's lips curled into a small, wry smile. That's the thing about feeling, Lord Whimsy. It's rarely ever right. He stepped back slightly, allowing Whimsy to enter. Please come in. We've got much to discuss. Whimsy hesitated, only for a moment, then followed, his mind racing to catch up with the revelations swirling in his head. He had known there was something deeply wrong about the Winthorpe family's history, but seeing the living ghost of that history now, standing before him in a hidden room of the manor, made the truth all the more chilling. Inside, the room was sparse. A small fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old paper, the remnants of a life that had long been erased. Lysander Gray motioned for Whimsy to sit in the single armchair by the fire. Without waiting for Whimsy's assent, he sat opposite, eyes never leaving his visitor's face. I imagine you're wondering why I didn't just come forward, Lysander said, his voice low and gravelly, betraying years of silence. Why? I've remained hidden, playing a role in this theater of secrets. Whimsy sat, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap. The pieces of the puzzle had been falling into place, but now that he was so close to the core of the mystery, he felt the weight of the moment. I don't know yet what game you're playing, Lysander, Whimsy said carefully, his eyes narrowing. But I know one thing, you didn't stay hidden for the family's sake. You didn't return to solve a murder. This is about something deeper, something far more personal. Lysander's eyes flickered, then softened, a strange sadness creeping into his features. You're right. This isn't about money or revenge. Not entirely. His gaze dropped to the fire, his voice taking on a darker edge. It's about betrayal, the deepest kind of betrayal. Whimsy remained silent, letting the words hang in the air. He could see the cracks forming in Lysander's calm facade, the man's control slipping as he spoke. I didn't die, Lord Whimsy, That was a lie that I had to tell for my own survival. They killed me, but I refused to die. Lysander's voice was filled with raw emotion now, something Whimsy hadn't expected. I had discovered the truth about my sister, Margaret, the woman I had loved, the woman I thought I knew. Whimsy leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift in the story. What truth? What happened to Margaret? Lysander's eyes met his with a quiet fury. She wasn't the woman they made her out to be. She wasn't the saintly figure everyone adored. Margaret had secrets, dark ones. She had been involved with Nathaniel Quinn, not just financially, but emotionally, and she had planned to leave her husband for him. Whimsy's mind reeled. It wasn't just a simple affair. It was a life-altering betrayal, the kind that would destroy everything. But it wasn't just about love, Lysander continued, his voice growing more intense. Margaret had also uncovered something even more dangerous, the Winthorpes. Wealth didn't come from farming or business. It came from darker dealings, smuggling, bribery, maybe even murder. Whimsy's breath caught in his throat as the pieces began to fall into place. Margaret had stumbled upon something she shouldn't have. The Winthorpes weren't just a rich family, they were involved in criminal activities that spanned decades. And Margaret, in her pursuit of truth and freedom, had paid the price for that knowledge. She was going to expose them, Lysander whispered, his face twisted in bitterness. She was going to destroy everything they had built, everything they had lied about. So they killed her. Whimsy shook his head, trying to understand the magnitude of it all. And you were hiding because of her. You knew the truth, and they didn't want anyone to know. Lysander's expression hardened. Yes, but that wasn't the worst of it. After her death, they erased her from history. They erased me, too. I had to disappear to protect myself. But I never stopped watching. I never stopped knowing what was going on in this house. His voice dropped, almost to a whisper. I waited for the right time to return, to set things right. Whimsy could see it now. Lysander wasn't a ghost, not just of the family, but of justice. A man who had watched as the lies festered and grew. The Winthorpes had silenced him, and now he had returned, not for vengeance, but for a reckoning. A chance to undo the wrongs of the past. But why the game? Whimsy asked, his brow furrowed. Why all the subterfuge, the missing ledger, the manipulations with the staff? Why not just come forward and tell the truth? Lysander's lips curled bitterly. Because I knew what would happen. I knew they would bury it. You think they would just let me walk in and take control of their carefully constructed lies? They would have discredited me in an instant. So I had to make sure the truth came out. Slowly, methodically, one piece at a time. Whimsy understood now. This wasn't about a single crime. It wasn't even about Margaret's murder. It was about everything the Winthorpes had built on lies, about everything they had hidden in plain sight for so long. Lysander had returned, not just for his sister, but for the legacy she had tried to expose. The real crime here, Lysander continued, his voice trembling with conviction, is that they have kept their lives, their fortunes, their power, all built on secrets that should have been brought to light years ago. And they've buried the truth with the bodies of people who have tried to stop them. Whimsy felt the weight of those words, the full gravity of what was happening. He had thought this case was about a single death, a single murder, but in reality, it was about the collapse of an entire empire built on lies and deceit. And the man sitting before him wasn't just a murderer's ghost. He was the last survivor of a long-forgotten war, one fought in shadows, through betrayal and manipulation, and Lysander had returned to end it. What now? Whimsy asked, his voice calm but filled with the tension of the moment. Lysander's eyes flickered with a dangerous glint. Now, we finish it. We bring everything to light. We expose every lie, every conspiracy. We don't stop until the truth is known. And those who have been hiding for so long are finally held accountable. The stakes had never been higher. The investigation was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about dismantling an entire system of corruption. And Whimsy, for the first time, saw the full scope of what he was up against. The game had changed. And it was no longer just a question of finding out who killed Margaret Winthorpe. It was about ending the web of lies that had held this family and the people connected to it in its grip for far too long. The room was suffocatingly still, the crackling fire the only sound breaking the silence between them. Lysander Gray's confession hung in the air like a heavy mist, settling into every corner of Whimsy's mind. He had expected many things from this case, but this depth of familial betrayal, of deceit that stretched across generations, was a layer he had never fully anticipated. Yet, here he was on the cusp of understanding everything, standing face to face with the last living man who knew the truth. And now it was time to act. Whimsy rose from his seat, a slow, deliberate movement. He had all the pieces. He'd unraveled the story that had been buried for so long. A labyrinth of lies, betrayal, and hidden agendas. But it wasn't enough to understand it. He had to expose it, force the truth out into the light, no matter the cost. Lysander watched him, his eyes sharp but tinged with something else now, a deep, weary resignation. He had known this moment would come, but even so, there was something vulnerable in the way he watched Whimsy prepare for the next step. "You've done your part," Lysander said quietly. "You've uncovered everything, but it won't make a difference. Not now. The Winthorpes will fight to keep their secrets buried. I know." Whimsy's voice was calm, controlled, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "But I'm not leaving until the truth is exposed. Not this time. Not when it's this close." He turned toward the door, moving with purpose. Lysander said nothing, his gaze following Whimsy's every step. The detective had come this far. There was no turning back now. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Whimsy strode through the hallways, his mind already on the final confrontation that loomed ahead. He had arranged everything carefully, every detail, every move. The Winthorpes would gather for dinner soon, unaware of the trap he was setting. He had been watching them, noting their reactions, their habits, and now he knew who would crack under pressure. As he made his way to the main drawing room, his thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps behind him. He turned, his hand instinctively moving toward his pocket, where the concealed note lay, proof that would expose the final piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Cartwright stood at the end of the hall, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together. "Lord Whimsy," she said, her voice low and steady, "you think you've won, but you've only just scratched the surface of what's been hidden here. There's more to all of this, much more." Whimsy gave her a brief, measured glance, then continued walking. "If you're trying to intimidate me, Mrs. Cartwright, you're too late. I've already seen the truth. It's all there, the names, the lies, the years of deceit. You can't stop it now." Her expression flickered, a flash of something fear, perhaps before her usual composure returned. "You think you've seen everything. There are pieces you still don't understand, people you've underestimated, but I can see now that you're too far gone to listen." He stopped then, turning to face her fully, his gaze hard and unyielding. "Who, Mrs. Cartwright? Who have I underestimated? Who else is involved in this charade?" Her eyes shifted, but she said nothing. Whimsy's patience wore thin. "This is your last chance. You're part of this. You've been involved in keeping the Winthorpe secrets for years, haven't you? You know exactly what's been going on behind closed doors, and you've helped them cover it all up." Mrs. Cartwright's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her lips quivering. "You don't know what you're dealing with. You think you've won, but you've only uncovered a small part of the truth. You're playing a dangerous game, Lord Whimsy, and you will regret it." Whimsy didn't flinch. "I'm not playing games. I'm ending them." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the hallway, leaving Mrs. Cartwright standing there, her figure shrinking into the shadows. Her threats didn't faze him. He had come too far, and nothing, no matter how much she tried to intimidate him, would deter him now. The dinner was about to begin. As the Winthorpes filed into the dining room, the air was thick with an unspoken tension. Everyone took their seats, but the atmosphere was off. Even the staff seemed uneasy, as if they knew something was coming, but couldn't put their finger on what. Whimsy, standing near the doorway, watched them all closely. Lord Winthorpe at the head of the table, his face a mask of well-practiced indifference. Lady Helena, her eyes darting nervously between the others. Nathaniel Quinn, too calm, almost too eager to please. Then there was Mrs. Cartwright, who gave him a quick, assessing look before she turned her attention back to the room. Whimsy took a deep breath. It was now or never. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone commanding attention. "I hope you're all enjoying your meal, but I'm afraid we must put a stop to the pleasantries for a moment. There's something we need to discuss." The room fell silent at once. Eyes turned toward him, confused, apprehensive. "I have uncovered something," Whimsy continued, "something that will change everything for all of you. Secrets that have been hidden for far too long, and today we're going to expose them." He paused for effect, letting the words sink in. "I have the proof of your betrayal, your lies, and your manipulations, and it's all here." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the piece of paper, the names, the transactions, the smudged ink that had led him here. He held it up for all to see. At first, no one moved. The tension in the room thickened. Then, Lord Winthorpe's face twisted in sudden fury. "What is this nonsense, Whimsy?" He spat, his voice laced with anger. "You've come here with baseless accusations and baseless," Whimsy interrupted, his voice calm but steely. "I think you'll find that the evidence speaks for itself. Margaret knew what you were, Winthorpe. She knew about the money, the smuggling, the deals you made under the table. She was going to expose you all. And when she did, you couldn't risk it." He let the words hang in the air, watching as Lord Winthorpe's eyes flickered with a mix of panic and rage. "It was never about the money, was it?" Whimsy continued, his gaze never leaving the man. "It was about power, control, keeping the truth buried, even if it meant silencing your own family." There was a long, tense silence before Lady Helena finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she said, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. "We thought we could keep it all contained. But Lysander, he wouldn't let it go." Lysander Gray, standing at the back of the room, spoke. Then, his voice low and resolute. "No, I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let you all continue with your lies, ruining lives just to protect your precious legacy. I came back to put an end to it. The truth was out now. There was no more hiding, no more false narratives the Winthorpes were trapped in, their own web of deceit, and no amount of denial could save them." Lord Winthorpe's face twisted in desperation, and for a moment, it looked as though he might attempt to flee. But Whimsy was ready for it. He had planned for every eventuality. As the older man stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, Whimsy took a step forward, his voice steady and commanding. "It's over," he said simply, and in that moment, it was. The Winthorpes were cornered. The truth had finally come to light, and there was no escape. The final confrontation had ended, and with it, the dark empire of secrets that had ruled over Winthorpe Manor for so long began to crumble. The air in the dining room felt thicker now, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the tension that crackled between the assembled guests. The Winthorpes, once so poised, now sat in stunned silence, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright dread. Lysander Gray's return had shattered everything, and now the final act was unfolding before them. Wimsey stood at the center of the room, the evidence he had presented still in his hand, his gaze unwavering as he faced the gathered family. There was no escape for them now. The trap had been set, the lies had been exposed, and every hidden truth had been dragged kicking and screaming into the light. He could almost hear the clattering of their minds, desperately searching for a way to salvage something from the wreckage. But then, just as Whimsy thought it was over, just as he began to allow himself the smallest breath of triumph, something unexpected happened. A faint sound interrupted the silence, a soft, almost imperceptible knock on the door. The room shifted, all eyes moving toward the door, but no one dared speak. The knock came again, louder this time, as if urging someone to open it. Whimsy's brow furrowed. No one had been expected. Everyone who had been involved was already here, seated around the table, staring at him, waiting for him to make his next move. Whimsy's instincts kicked in. He signaled to the two officers who had accompanied him. Without a word, they moved quickly, positioning themselves near the door, ready to respond to whatever was about to unfold. The door creaked open. Standing there in the doorway was a figure none of them had anticipated. A woman dressed in a simple black coat, her face obscured by a veil. She stepped forward, and for a moment, the room fell into utter silence. The woman's eyes scanned the room quickly, taking in the sight of the tense, charged atmosphere. She wasn't surprised by the scene. Instead, her expression seemed tinged with knowing, like someone who had been expecting this moment for a long time. Whimsy's pulse quickened. He hadn't planned for this. Who was this woman? How did she? No. May I help you? Whimsy's voice was firm but cautious. His eyes narrowed, trying to read the woman's presence and purpose. The woman didn't immediately answer. She simply stepped further into the room, moving with an almost regal grace, though there was something unsettling about the way she moved. Her veil fluttered slightly as she moved, but her gaze remained fixed on Lord Winthrop, who had frozen at the sight of her. The air in the room felt charged again, as if a new layer of tension had been added, the kind that only the unexpected arrival of an unknown figure could bring. "I'm sorry to intrude," the woman finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying a note of authority that couldn't be ignored. "But I think you'll find that the truth is far from over." The words landed with the weight of a stone thrown into a still pond, rippling across the room. Lord Winthrop stood quickly, his face pale, his eyes wide with recognition. "Catherine," he whispered, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. Whimsy's mind raced. The name echoed in his head. Catherine. There was no Catherine in the Winthrop family. No one connected to the estate by that name, at least not within the bounds of what he had uncovered. Yet, the way Lord Winthrop spoke, it was clear this woman was someone from the very heart of his past, someone important. The woman reached up, pulling the veil back slowly, revealing a face that stunned everyone in the room. The sharp features, the steely gaze, and the unmistakable resemblance to Lord Winthrop himself left no doubt. This was no distant relative or mere acquaintance. This was someone far more integral to the fabric of the Winthrop story. Catherine Winthrop, the older sister of Lord Winthrop, presumed dead for decades. Her disappearance a cold case wrapped in whispers. A woman who had vanished from the estate at a young age. Her absence one of the many carefully hidden secrets of the Winthrop family. But she hadn't disappeared. She'd been silenced. The room was frozen, every eye on her, none of them daring to speak. Catherine's gaze swept across the room, lingering just a moment longer on Lysander. A flicker of something passed between them, recognition, understanding, maybe even a shared grief. "You didn't think you could keep it buried forever, did you, Hugh?" Catherine's voice broke the silence again, her tone cool and filled with an unsettling calm. "You thought that by removing me, by erasing me from the records, you could continue your little empire. But you were wrong." Lord Winthrop's face twisted with a mix of rage and fear. "Catherine, no. You can't." "I can," she interrupted sharply. "And I will." Whimsy watched the scene unfold, his mind spinning, the final piece clicking into place. This was no ordinary twist. This was not simply a secret from the past. This was the real mastermind, the one who had orchestrated the years of deceit, the one who had manipulated the Winthrops and controlled their actions. From the shadows, Catherine Winthrop had never been dead. She had simply disappeared because she had chosen to vanish. She had left everything behind, watched as the family she had once known tore itself apart, all while biding her time, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally come to light. And now, she had returned not just to clear her name, but to claim her place, to finish what she had started all those years ago. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Hugh," Catherine continued, her eyes never leaving her brother. "And now it's time to face the consequences of your actions." Whimsy stood in stunned silence, his thoughts racing to keep up with the sudden flood of revelations. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had pieced together was now turned on its head. Lysander, Mrs. Cartwright, the Winthrops, financial dealings, the smuggling, all of it had been a smokescreen for the real power behind the scenes. And Catherine, the woman presumed dead, had been pulling the strings all along. "You were the one who orchestrated Margaret's death, weren't you?" Whimsy asked, his voice firm, cutting through the tension. Catherine looked directly at him, a wisp of a smile playing at her lips. "I didn't orchestrate it, Lord Whimsy, but I knew it had to happen. She was too much of a risk. She was too close to uncovering what we had built here. It wasn't just a family business, it was a network, a system, and she was ready to dismantle it. Lysander spoke now, his voice low but full of venom. "You sold your soul, Catherine. You walked away from everything we once believed in, everything you once believed in, just to maintain your hold over this place." Catherine's gaze softened for a moment, but only for a brief instant. "You think I sold my soul? I did what I had to. You, Lysander, you were always too weak to see it. But I knew what had to be done, and I did it." The room was still. The final revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. The detective's genius had been tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had seemed like the end, a triumphant conclusion to a web of lies and secrets, now appeared to be only the beginning. Catherine Winthrop, the true mastermind, had revealed herself at the last moment, shaking everything Whimsy thought he understood to its core. But he wasn't finished. Not yet. He stepped forward, his expression hardening with the knowledge that this was far from over. "The game isn't over, Catherine," Whimsy said quietly, his voice steady and unyielding. "You've made your move, but it's too late to stop now." Catherine's lips tightened into a grim smile. "We'll see, Lord Whimsy. We'll see." And in that moment, everything was uncertain again. The room had become a battleground of words, each exchange more volatile than the last. Catherine Winthrop's revelation had shattered the fragile calm that had hung over the estate. She wasn't just a victim of her family's twisted games. She was the mastermind, the unseen hand that had pulled the strings for decades. Yet, in the chaos of her return, Whimsy's mind raced not with anger or frustration, but with clarity. As the tension mounted, there was something that had been gnawing at him, an itch at the back of his mind that refused to be scratched until now. He had missed it, hadn't seen it before, but now it was undeniable. The one thing that kept the pieces from fitting perfectly, the one thing that made the story feel incomplete, was the absence of a crucial detail. Whimsy took a deep breath, his eyes flicking between the shocked faces of the Winthrops and the still, steely presence of Catherine. He could see it now, unfolding in front of him as the last of the fog cleared. The truth, the entire truth, had been hiding in plain sight all along, like a mirage waiting for the right moment to shift into focus. "Lord Whimsy?" Lysander's voice cracked, breaking the silence. His face was pale, his hands trembling at his sides. "You've got to do something. You can't let her." Whimsy held up a hand, signaling for him to be quiet. "I already know what happened," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "I know why this has all come to pass." Catherine's lips curled in a tight smile, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Oh, do you?" she asked, her voice laced with mocking amusement. "You think you've uncovered all of it, Lord Whimsy? You think you understand what's really been happening here?" "I do," Whimsy replied calmly, but his gaze was piercing, focused. "You made a mistake, Catherine, one that's going to cost you more than you realize." The others in the room, her brother, Nathaniel, even Mrs. Cartwright, watched in stunned silence as Whimsy moved toward the fireplace, where a heavy ledger lay open, the ink fading under years of neglect. He had examined it earlier in the investigation, but now, with the truth finally within his reach, it held new meaning. "You thought you were clever, hiding behind shadows and secrets," Whimsy continued, his voice gaining momentum. "You thought you could orchestrate this whole thing, keep everyone in the dark. But you missed something. You missed me." He turned, holding up the page from the ledger, his fingers tracing the names written there. "You thought the list of names here was a red herring. You even went as far as to plant false evidence, guiding me down the wrong path with your carefully calculated steps. But you didn't account for one thing." Catherine's gaze never wavered. "And what would that be?" "That I would notice the gaps, that I would recognize the one name you hadn't crossed out, the one name that didn't belong." Whimsy stepped forward, his eyes locked with hers. "You were so careful with your deception, Catherine, so meticulous in your planning. But you left one clue that you couldn't erase, one thing you couldn't control." The room fell silent as Whimsy's words sank in. The Winthrops were paralyzed, each of them caught in the pull of the detective's certainty, as if the truth itself was suffocating them. "The one name that never should have been here," Whimsy said slowly, deliberately. "The name of someone who was supposed to be gone." Margaret Winthrop, for a moment. Catherine's expression faltered, her eyes flashing with something darker than anger. But it was too late. Whimsy had already pieced together the rest. You didn't just kill Margaret because she knew too much about your operations, Whimsy continued, his voice rising in volume. You killed her because she was the one who had the key to your family's downfall, the one who had the will to expose it all, but you knew there was more at stake, more than just the family fortune. Catherine's face twisted, her features contorting with an emotion Whimsy had seen all too often, fear. You didn't count on Margaret's connection to someone else, Whimsy said, his voice sharp with revelation, someone she had known before, the man who had been helping her with the evidence, someone who would never back down. Lysander's head snapped up, his eyes wide. You knew? He whispered, as though the truth was suddenly too much to bear. Yes, Whimsy said. I knew all along. You were the key to unlocking this entire mess, Lysander. You were the one who could have stopped it, but you, too, were a pawn. A pawn. In Catherine's game. Lysander's breath caught, his body trembling. You mean to say I Whimsy nodded gravely. Yes, you were the one who kept the ledger hidden, the one who uncovered the secrets, but was too afraid to reveal them. You held the truth for years, Lysander, and Catherine used that fear against you. The truth was coming together now in a clear, undeniable way. The web of deceit spun by Catherine had been intricate, but there was something even more damning than her manipulation of the family. The real story wasn't just about wealth or power. It was about control over the truth itself. Whimsy turned back to Catherine. You underestimated me, he said coldly. And now you've run out of places to hide. She stood there, her chest heaving, as though the weight of her own actions had finally caught up with her. You can't stop it now, she said, her voice shaking, but there was something hollow in it. You can't take it all back. The family's legacy, everything I've built, it's too late. I'm not here to take anything from you, Whimsy replied. I'm here to expose it. And now everyone will know what you did. The truth will come out. Catherine, it already has. But just as it seemed the moment was reaching its crescendo, something shifted again. Something darker. Without warning, a flash of movement startled everyone. The doors to the dining room burst open, and before anyone could react, Catherine was gone. The Winthorpes' heads snapped toward the door. Catherine was nowhere to be seen. Her footsteps faded quickly down the hallway, the echo of her escape reverberating through the manor like a final taunt. Whimsy stood motionless for a moment, the weight of her disappearance sinking in. He had been so sure. She had been cornered, caught in the trap he had laid. And yet, at the very last moment, she had slipped through his fingers. She's gone, Lysander whispered, his face pale as he looked at Whimsy. She got away. Whimsy exhaled slowly, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Not entirely. There was something still hanging in the air, something unfinished. The case, it seemed, wasn't as resolved as he had thought. Though Catherine had escaped, Whimsy knew that there was no escaping the truth. She could run, she could hide, but her lies would come to light, and he had no doubt that one day justice would be served. But for now, he could only wait, knowing that the final pieces of the puzzle were still in motion, and that was enough, for now at least. The manor was still, the weight of its silence settling like dust on the furniture, on the faces of those who had been left behind in the wake of Catherine's escape. Whimsy stood in the middle of the drawing room, his back to the closed door through which she had vanished, the final pieces of the puzzle scattered before him like a half-completed jigsaw. He had done it. He had uncovered the truth, exposed the Winthorpes' darkest secrets, and laid bare the criminal scheming that had been going on for years. Yet something gnawed at him, something felt incomplete. Catherine had slipped away, but it wasn't just her escape that disturbed him. It was the nagging feeling that there was one last question left, unanswered, a question buried beneath layers of deception, hidden in plain sight, just waiting to be discovered. Whimsy felt the eyes of the family on him, their silent pleas for closure hanging in the air. They wanted answers, but he knew better than anyone that answers weren't always so easily given. He had done what he could, expose the truth, brought justice to the surface, but the questions that remained were bigger than any case he had ever handled before. Turning slowly, Whimsy's gaze swept over the room, Lord Winthrop, still shaken from the revelations, had collapsed into an armchair, his face a study of regret and disbelief. Lady Helena, her hands folded in her lap, stared into the distance, her mind lost somewhere far away from this moment. Nathaniel Quinn fidgeted, his eyes darting around nervously, as if waiting for something or someone to jump out of the shadows. And then there was Mrs. Cartwright, the ever-watchful, ever-calculating matriarch, her expression unreadable. But Whimsy saw the flicker in her eyes, the way her gaze lingered on him for just a second too long, before she quickly averted her eyes, almost as if she was hiding something. It was subtle, but Whimsy caught it. There was more to this family than met the eye. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of footsteps on the floor, a sound that had become familiar in the moments before the door had opened. He turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was Lysander. His face was pale, his features drawn tight with exhaustion, but there was something else in his eyes, something that Whimsy had seen before, the unmistakable shadow of someone who had been through too much and yet still had one more secret left to reveal. "I need to speak with you," Lysander said, quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you haven't seen yet, something you need to understand." Whimsy's heart skipped a beat. He had thought the case was over, but the look in Lysander's eyes told him otherwise. He nodded, stepping aside to allow the young man into the room. Lysander walked past him, his every movement calculated, deliberate. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with a burden he had carried for far too long. "Catherine wasn't the only one who had a plan," Lysander said, his eyes locking onto Whimsy's with an intensity that sent a chill down the detective's spine. "There's more to this story, something bigger than just us." Whimsy's mind clicked into overdrive, the pieces falling into place with alarming speed. What are you saying?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. Lysander hesitated, clearly struggling with the words. "You were right about everything," he said slowly. "Catherine manipulated us all, used us to cover her tracks. But there's something she didn't count on, something that's still hidden, buried somewhere in this house. And if we don't find it, none of this will make sense. All the secrets, all the lies, it'll be for nothing." Whimsy felt his pulse quicken. He had known, deep down, that something was still missing. He had uncovered the Winthrop legacy of deceit, but the fact that Catherine had been able to orchestrate everything from the shadows meant there was more at play here. What are you talking about?" Whimsy pressed, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What's still hidden?" Lysander stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The evidence you found, the ledger, the names, the connections, it's all part of a larger scheme. But there's one name that's never shown up, one person who wasn't supposed to be involved, someone who might be behind it all." Whimsy's breath caught, who he had crossed off every name, every lead. But if there was one person still unaccounted for, it could change everything. "You're talking about someone else. Who?" Whimsy demanded, his heart pounding in his chest. Lysander looked round the room, as if making sure no one else could overhear. His voice dropped to a whisper. "It's someone outside the family, Whimsy. Someone who has been pulling the strings all along. Someone who knew everything about us, and someone who still might have control over all of this." Whimsy's mind raced. His thoughts darted back to the cryptic messages he had uncovered, those odd notes, the subtle hints. It was all starting to make sense now. Catherine hadn't been the only one with a hidden agenda. There was someone else, someone with the power and the cunning to remain in the shadows while everyone else fought for control. Whimsy turned sharply, scanning the room again, his eyes now locked onto Mrs. Cartwright. Her gaze avoided his, and her lips tightened ever so slightly. "Is it her?" Whimsy asked quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. "Mrs. Cartwright. She's the one you're talking about." Lysander didn't respond at first, but the slight tension in his shoulders said everything. Whimsy's instincts had been right all along. The woman who had seemed to merely observe, the matriarch who had silently guided the family through decades of turmoil, was hiding something far more dangerous. Suddenly, the entire investigation, the maze of motives, lies, and deceit began to unravel again, not into a neat conclusion, but into a widening spiral that could swallow them all. Catherine might have been the obvious villain, but the truth was deeper, more insidious. Whimsy exhaled slowly, realizing that the threads he had pulled at, the mysteries he had unraveled, were leading him down an entirely new path. The case wasn't over, not by a long shot. The true mastermind, the one who had engineered everything from the shadows, was still out there. And the only thing that had changed was that Whimsy had finally found a name to chase. He turned to Lysander, his mind already shifting gears, the familiar thrill of the chase reigniting within him. "We'll find them," Whimsy said firmly, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "We're not done yet." And as he turned toward the door, a new mystery began to form, one that would take him deeper into the Winthorpe family's web of secrecy. The questions remained, the hidden truths, the mysteries that would never be fully solved. For Whimsy, the investigation had only just begun. The game was far from over.